welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host today, and I'm really excited about this chat. So I'm going to ask our guest to introduce herself and tell us about what she does and about the tattoo museum that she works with.
Oh, hi. My name's Myles, and I co-own Daredevil Tattoo in New York City. And me and my business partner, Brad Fink, opened in 1997, and we have a tattoo museum that's a part of our tattoo shop. And we happen to be located down the street from the Bowery in Chatham Square, which is recognized as basically the birthplace of modern tattooing.
So 1997 is actually kind of a big year for tattooing in New York City. I remember it well because prior to that, was it not legal to get tattooed in New York City?
Yeah, it was illegal from 1961 until 97. And I actually started tattooing in 91. So I worked for 6 years underground before it was legalized.
So what was the reasoning, first of all, for it being not legal in New York City? Um, yeah.
Uh, it's like nobody's really 100% sure why tattooing was banned in New York. There's a lot of different theories out there. I think the official reason was that they blamed it on a hepatitis outbreak. But then I've also heard stories that it was the same time that they started immunizing the military for hepatitis. And then I also heard stories that like there was this well-to-do woman was on the Bowery, and she was kind of sightseeing and went into like the Moskowitz brothers shop, and they threw her out and weren't very nice to her. And I know people speculate, or I guess she said she had some connections and was like, "You're going to regret this." And so,
So
that's
so
the
she was she
theory.
was she was what we would what today, an apology for anybody who has this name, because I've met very lovely people with this name. So she was like a Karen before we called people Karens.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was like a kind of a thing back when that people would go down to the Bowery to, back then they even called it slumming it. They would go and they'd kind of want to gawk at like all the craziness that was down there. The Bowery was a pretty rough and tumble place, and so sometimes you'd have like these more well-off people would go down there just to kind of take in the sights and sort of look at all the weirdos and everything. And so for whatever reason, this the story is this lady went into their shop, and Stanley and Walter were not accommodating and or polite. And she, some people said she was like married to a senator or something like that. And but then there was also speculation that maybe they banned tattooing because it was like around the time of the New York World's Fair, and they wanted to kind of clean up the city. So nobody really knows for certain.
So you mentioned that you got into it before and you were underground. What was that like? How did you get into tattooing?
I got my first tattoo when I was in high school, and I was a punk rock kid. And just whenever I had some extra money, I, would get more tattoos, and just whenever I could kind of hang out in tattoo shops. And at some point, when I was in art school, and my roommate started tattooing, and well, she bought a starter kit, and so that kind of gave me the idea. And I didn't really have a I didn't have like a proper apprenticeship since it was illegal. You couldn't go to a shop and apprentice, but maybe that worked in my favor because just being a girl back then, probably it's very hard to get an apprenticeship anytime, these days back then. And so probably I wouldn't have done well if I would have gone into a shop and asked for an apprenticeship. And so this way I kind of just fumbled along on my own for a couple of years. And at some point I got a job in a legal street shop out in Jersey. And I feel like that was what really taught me how to tattoo, because it was a very busy shop. And so I was just tattooing like 8 or 10 hours a day, many days a week. And so that really was what helped me out. But as far as tattooing when it was illegal goes, it was never really enforced in any way. Like, I think in the 30 something years it was illegal. Like nobody was ever actually like busted for tattooing. So I used to advertise in the back of the Village Voice, and it was just word of mouth. And yeah, I used to tattoo cops all the time, and they didn't care. It was more of a health code violation. It wasn't like a criminal offense. I think if anything, you could get maybe like a summons or something. So yeah, just no sign out front or anything, but mostly it was word of mouth.
Yeah, I do distinctly remember prior to 97 walking around the village, and there were definitely tattoo shops. I mean, without a doubt. And
Yeah,
yeah.
it got to the point where it's kind of ridiculous that it was illegal because people were opening up shops. But most of the tattooers I knew, myself included, none of us were pushing for it to be legalized, because it sort of kept a lot of tattooers out of the city, and so it sort of kept the competition down somewhat.
So let's talk about the museum. When did it begin? And you talked a little bit about, you said the Moskowitz brothers shop on the Bowery. Talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you have there and how it all started.
Well, we moved to our current location in 2014. We used to be up like on Ludlow and Houston over by Katz's Deli. And then in 2014, we moved like 7 blocks south. So now we're like on Canal Street and between like Essex and Ludlow. And when we were setting up the shop, my business partner Brad, he has like this really massive collection of antique tattoo stuff. And so when we were trying to figure out how we were going to design the space, I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if you hung up a couple original things in the shop. And Brad was like, oh, I could fill this whole place up. And so that was what we did. And we thought if there was any place that really needed a tattoo museum, it was definitely New York City, and especially being where we were close to Chatham Square in the Bowery. It's a very rich history down there. And so we, think it's really cool to share this collection that we have, and to, just share that history with other people and other tattooers. And before the pandemic, I mean, we, used to get visitors pretty much every day from all over the world. It's definitely tourism has slowed down in New York since the pandemic. But it is really cool, like how many visitors we get, and that people are so excited to see some of the stuff that we have.
What are some of your favorite things that you have?
I mean, probably the most famous thing we have is we have the Sundancer, which was this painting by Bert Grimm. And then we have a lot of like artwork, but then we also have a lot of antique tattoo machines. And probably one of the most notable pieces we have is the Thomas Edison engraving pen that the first electric tattoo machine patent was based off of. And the uh, first electric tattoo machine patent was by this tattooer named Samuel O'Reilly, and he patented it in 1891. And he worked over in Chatham Square, so that's just like a couple blocks away from where we are. And basically his patent, it sort of like reconfigured a little bit this Thomas Edison device that was Edison had invented in 1876, and it was the first patent for a motorized device in the United States. And he invented it when he was working in the telegraph office, and it was basically the first copying device. Like it was this perforating pen, and you would write on paper with it. It would punch holes in the paper, and then you would roll like ink over the paper. It was all sold like in this kit together, with with the batteries and, the special ink and the roller and everything and this paper. And so you would it worked kind of like a pounce. And so it would, punch these tiny little holes. And then I think, you can make like hundreds of copies like with it, but it was sort of kind of outdated, like not too long after he invented it. So it wasn't like that much of a, uh, business like success for him as, compared to like a bunch of his other inventions. But the tattooers were looking at this new technology and they were trying to figure out like how they could incorporate it into tattooing because before this, tattoos were hand poke, which was a very tedious, slow process. And so they were experimenting with all these new devices to try to figure out like how they could kind of bring tattooing into the machine age. And like one of the other devices that we have in the collection is a dental plugger. And that was another thing that like I guess it was used for packing cavities. And so it was like this handheld device. And so, tattooers were just looking at all this stuff and trying to figure out how they could adapt it. And it's kind of funny because if you see like the advertising from the time back then, after they did start using these electric machines, it's like they usually advertised them as like painless, electric, and speeds up the process. And it's just sort of funny that they, all claim that tattooing was pain-free now that it was electric, but you're still poking holes in people. So
Yeah, I mean, having been tattooed a few times, certainly there's places that are less painful than others, but I think what it seems to me also is, just the different ointments and everything sort of help. But I mean, I would wrap, trust me, like I like the fact that we have the electric machines, the hand poking. I know some people still do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, actually, just last week we had an artist visiting from Japan, and he used the traditional tabori technique. He uses this particular artist uses a machine to outline, but then he uses hand poke technique to shade in his designs. So there are people who still do hand poke tattoos, and I'd say there's even kind of like a little bit of a trend of people contemporary tattooers doing hand poke designs, just I guess for the novelty of it. But it definitely changed the industry quite a bit when it was mechanized.
For sure. And it's just interesting today when you just see the art and how the art kind of evolves, but then like that classic flash is kind of evergreen, like you see every possible type of tattoo from like super realistic to, I mean, there's like watercolor, but no matter what, like you can always go to a place and see, like your classic hearts and your anchors or just different variations of it. And it's just really cool how, things evolve and also inform each other from the past.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started tattooing in the early 90s, like you couldn't give traditional tattoos away. People were, completely not interested in that style of tattooing. And I think it's like you kind of go through this generational thing, and it's like a lot of people back then, like they were like, oh, I don't want to have a tattoo that looks like my grandpa. And it was kind of funny because at our old location, we actually had a few copies of some of Brad's designs like up on the wall, and people would come in and they'd be like, "Oh God, does anybody ever get this stuff?" And so it was interesting to see like people kind of come around to appreciate it. And I think it was maybe like you had the Sailor Jerry, like there was a clothing line for a while, and then the Ed Hardy clothing line. And so I think people started to wrap their head around the imagery, and they started to appreciate its charm and how timeless it was. And yeah, it was definitely fun to like have all that like become something that people, they understood it and they wanted it, because it's definitely, in my opinion, some of the most fun stuff to tattoo.
So what what were some of the tattoo studios in the city before, it was banned? Like what is some interesting history, and do you have any remnants of it in the museum?
Before it was banned, like the earliest tattooer, like when we moved into our space, I thought it would be interesting to research the old Bowery tattooers and to kind of like try to go back and figure out where everybody was working and when everybody was working. And so I wanted to figure out like the earliest tattooer I could find. And so the first artist to open up a permanent place of business for tattooing in the United States was a tattooer named Martin Hildebrandt. And he was first listed as tattooing in the New York City directory in 1858. So, New York's tattoo history is like definitely rich. It goes back very far. I mean, even, pre-Civil War. And he was not on the Bowery. He was a little bit like closer to the waterfront. His first place he was listed was on Water Street, actually. And then after Hildebrandt, there was kind of like O'Reilly was the most prominent tattooer of his time, and he was working with an artist named Elmer Getchell, and the two of them kind of worked together on patenting the electric machine, and but then the two of them ended up in court fighting over it. But right like along the Bowery and Chatham Square, it's maybe like 4 or 5 blocks. It's kind of wild because, the more I started digging, the more, it's like seeing like all these addresses. There are just these couple of blocks right there that all these tattooers were just like jammed on top of each other. And there were, so many artists. And I'm still like finding names of people, and finding different addresses and stuff. And I also found photographs that match like a lot of the buildings that are still there. And we do have, our museum, like we definitely like really focus on trying to collect stuff that pertains to New York's tattoo history. That's kind of like our specialty at this point. And we're always after new stuff. And we actually just got a really amazing piece for our collection that is a sign that is by Samuel O'Reilly, and I think it was from his travel book. And so we were super excited to get that. It was a woman found it at a Goodwill in Oklahoma City. Um, and
Wow.
yeah, I know. I actually, yeah, I flew to Oklahoma last week to pick it up. But
Cool.
yeah, and we have a sign that was from Charlie Wagner, and we have photos from back in the day, and flash from a bunch of the different artists from back then. Like we have a piece that's by Lou Alberts. Lou Alberts was called Lou the Jew, and he worked with Charlie Wagner. And he's the one who's really credited with inventing tattoo flash, which is what we call the designs that are hung up on the wall. Lou Alberts worked as a wallpaper designer before he was a tattoo artist. So maybe that's where he got the idea to kind of hang the sheets up instead of, having stuff in a book. And we have some artifacts from Charlie Wagner. Wagner, when O'Reilly passed away, Charlie Wagner was the one who took over O'Reilly's space on Chatham Square and worked there for like 50 years almost. And when I first started tattooing in the early 90s, you actually used to see old guys with tattoos from Charlie Wagner. And he was, he would tattoo people for a quarter. He was 25-cent Charlie Wagner. And you could always tell his tattoos because he would have like these little sort of swirls with some stars by them. And so it was pretty cool to, see those guys walking around, with these old Wagner designs, but I haven't seen one of those in a long time.
So what about women in tattooing?
Back then, there was Millie Hull. She actually learned from Charlie Wagner, or he was the one who sold her like her first equipment. And Millie Hull used to advertise as being New York's only lady tattooer. And we have a really interesting article with Millie Hull in the museum that's from, she made the cover of Family Circle magazine in 1936. Um, so she definitely must have been a pretty tough lady because there weren't any other women tattooers. I mean, the other women sort of involved with tattooing back then would have been like the tattooed ladies. There were a lot of the dime museums on the Bowery, which kind of like all started with P.T. Barnum. He had his, his museums and stuff. And before you had movie theaters, dime museums were kind of like the sort of family entertainment that you would pay this like a dime to get inside of them, and you walk around with the family, and they'd have all these like oddities and performers and stuff. And pretty much any self-respecting dime museum would have a tattooed lady and a tattooed man, or they would even have a tattoo artist in there. Like O'Reilly worked in in dime museums.
It's so crazy to me just how, like when I got my first tattoo, it was 96. I was 16. That tattoo place should not have tattooed me at 16, but they did. But it was still a bit of a taboo where I was, and especially for girls, to get tattooed. But now the obviously the culture seems to be very, very different. Have you seen a big shift from an industry level?
You mean in terms of like women and the
Women and just tattooing in general, just the social, the way that your society sort of views it.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been drastic, the changes. I mean, when I first started getting tattooed, I got my first tattoo, I think it was like 1988. It was definitely an out there thing to do. I mean, I like the expression, I don't know where I heard it, but it was like somebody said, "Oh, you used to get tattooed to be out, and now you get tattooed to be in." And it's changed so much. I always think of it more like kind of like how like when women first started wearing pants, it's like it wasn't so much a trend as it just became acceptable. And so tattoos have, they're just accepted by mainstream culture. I mean, I was just like, I don't know, scrolling through like the New York Times, and found another ad with involving tattooing. I'm amazed, like just watching TV, how many brands now have kind of like grabbed onto tattooing as like a way to I guess catch your eye or whatever in advertising. It's like now it's like medications use people with tattoos, and phone companies, and you name it. It's been embraced by popular culture for better or for worse. And it's wild to me like how much it's changed. Because it used to be like people would kind of avoid you if you had tattoos, and now people want to talk to you and talk about their tattoos.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, it's sort of become, I don't know. I like the pants analogy. That's pretty cool. But also at the same time, I just kind of feel like it's opened up just a different way for people to express themselves. And, in the past, like maybe people would be like, oh, I'd love one, but I'd never get one because XYZ. And now it's like, is XYZ really an issue? You know, like people, like you mentioned, like you're seeing ads because this is what culture kind of is and sort of is evolving to be like, yeah, a lot of people have tattoos. This is life. So yeah.
It's funny to me, like, when people talk about tattooing being kind of a trend or a fad or whatever, and it's like, from the research I've done, it's like I found articles from the 1880s that talk about this new trend of tattooing. And there's an article from like 1900, and it says the headline is something like uh, tattooing fad is all the rage, and New York women are the victims. And and I can't really think of anything else that has been called a fad going back more than 100 years.
For sure. Yeah, without a doubt. So this is just if people want to come visit the museum, where are you located again?
We're at 141 Division Street. We're on the Lower East Side, kind of the edge of Chinatown. And we're Division Street is kind of like we got this little triangle in front of the shop where it sort of like bumps into Canal Street. So basically, we're at Canal between Ludlow and Essex. And yeah, we're right by the F train, the East Broadway stop. But the Lower East Side, it's a lot of fun to visit, like just in general, and we're really happy that we're like in the middle of like where there was so much tattoo history, and that it is so closely linked to the neighborhood. To me, it's kind of wild because when I first started working on the Lower East Side was, kind of like this dangerous, scary place. And tattoos were kind of like seen as like dangerous and scary and intimidating. And I feel like tattooing and Lower East Side have kind of like grown up together hand in hand. It's like I never would have thought that both of them would become so, I guess, posh.
And if somebody would like to jump on this fad and get a tattoo at your shop, or maybe add to this trend, how far in advance should you plan on booking, and how does that process work?
I mean, our shop, like we try to have people available for walk-ins, so people can just come in, and or they can book an appointment through our website. Me personally, they can email me and or through the website. But yeah, people can just like jump in and get tattooed. Come check out the museum and get a tattoo on the same day.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was really fun to talk to you. You know what? I do have a question though. What was your first tattoo?
Oh, I got my first tattoo when I was 17, and I was living in Texas, Houston for a brief moment, and I I wanted to get a Black Panther off the wall, but I only had $25, so I ended up getting a little black cat on my shoulder. And it was kind of like your tattoo experience, where midway through the tattoo, the tattooer was like, "Are you 18?" I said no, and he's like, "All right, if you're not, don't tell anyone where you got this." I was like, "Okay." So
Yeah.
yeah, that was my first experience. I had $25 in my pocket, and that was what I got.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was.
Michelle Myles at Daredevil Tattoo.
And if you enjoyed this episode, Michelle will be virtually appearing on, I believe, is it January 26th, Thursday, January 26th?
I think so.
Yeah, in the evening Eastern time. So please check Syosset Library's calendar for a link to the webinar, and you'll get a little bit of a tour of the museum, and there'll be some Q&A at the end. So I'm excited.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.